Hi there. My name is Hayden Liardini, and today I want to be talking about the failures of Plan Colombia and the failures of essentially the U.S. war on drugs, and particularly the U.S. intervention in the drug wars of Latin America and Colombia. When people usually think about the cocaine trade in Latin America, they usually picture, the violent cartels, Pablo Escobar, criminals, stuff like that. That's the traditional narrative that we've seen through shows like Narcos and a lot of other media. However, as seen through The Accountant Story by David Fisher, it's not just an issue of Colombia, and it's not something that can be solved by military intervention. The U.S. intervention in Latin America, particularly through Plan Colombia, reshaped rather than subdued the drug war. And more importantly, The Accountant Story demonstrates that cocaine was not simply just a Colombian criminal enterprise, but rather a global economic system sustained by international demand, economic networks, and supply chains, same as any other business. So by looking at Plan Colombia through not just as a Colombian issue and drug war not just as a Colombian issue, but rather an issue of globalization, we can better understand why the decades of military and financial intervention by the United States in particular never actually ended the cocaine trade. So in this slide, we see the established narrative, right? On the left, we can see Pablo Escobar, who's known, probably the most recognizable cartel leader and drug trafficker in history. And in the middle, we see the police raids, we see the bricks of cocaine, the money, the guns, laying everything out on the table. On the right, we see the arrest by Colombian forces of the cocaine producers, the cocoa, the people who break down, essentially create the drugs. These are the most common narratives and pictures that you see. And this wants to tell us that the drug war is about violent criminals, the corrupt government, and the law enforcement trying to stop them. And if that's true, then the solution seems pretty straightforward, right? It's arrest the traffickers and destroy the cocoa crops and smash the cartels, and it'll fix the cocaine trade, right? And that was the U.S.'s approach for decades, and through Plan Colombia especially. But we see through The Accountant Story and through looking at the history, it's not that easy. So instead of focusing only on the people committing the crimes, books like The Accountant Story ask us to examine the whole economic system, right? And the economic system of globalization and capitalism that we have in place today that allows these crimes to remain profitable. So I think that shift, going from crimes to economics, is the only way that we're really going to ever solve the drug trade and the drug war as a whole. So Plan Colombia first was thought of by George H.W. Bush, but it was taken into effect in 2000, the end of Clinton's presidency. And it was a joint operation between the United States and Colombia. The U.S. invested more than $10 billion into military aid, military intelligence, strengthening counter-narcotic operations in Colombia. And basically, the goal was to strengthen the Colombian government. The U.S., wanted to reduce the cocoa cultivation, weaken cartel and trafficking organizations like FARC, who were responsible for a lot of violence in the country. And we thought that by strengthening the Colombian state, we would decrease the amount of cocaine entering the United States. So some of the methods used during Plan Colombia was aerial fumigation of the crops, basically just poisoning and burning the cocoa fields, training the Colombian military under U.S. military guidelines, sharing counter-narcotic intelligence, and direct military support against traffickers and organizations like FARC. And at the time, many U.S. policymakers believed that if the production inside Colombia could be destroyed, the cocaine trade would collapse. But through history, we see that it's not the case. However, Plan Colombia was a success. It did modernize Colombia. We see on the left, Bogota is a very modern city. It's a big tourist destination for lots of Americans and other Western tourists, and Colombia became a lot safer of a country. The military got stronger, became less corrupt, kidnappings and homicides declined, and a lot of the cartel leaders were captured and killed. So Plan Colombia succeeded in modernizing and improving the living conditions in Colombia. However, one thing it did not do, which was its main goal, was decrease the amount of cocaine coming into the United States. cocaine was still coming in from Colombia and other Latin American countries. It was just in a modern setting now. So why did the drug trade survive even with the improvements of Plan Colombia, right? And the answer is that a military force can destroy a specific organization, but military force can't eliminate market demand. And we see through here that cocaine's not just simply a Colombian issue, right? It was transported often and produced often in Colombia, but it went all over the world and started all over Latin America. It moved across borders through shipping routes and cargo networks and distribution systems internationally. And as long as there's consumers in the United States and in Europe and Australia, and there's a demand, then other regions are going to continue to find a way to supply it, right? There's an economic incentive for it. So when one trafficking route was closed, let's say in Colombia, another one would just open right up. The traffickers, while they couldn't be in such large cartel groups as they were like under the Medellin cartel, they just found a way to be more flexible to, military intervention, right? So all it did was just modernize the drug trade. And I think that's a central lesson from the accountant story. The accountant story, it's not the drug smuggler's story, it's not the cartel story, it's the accountant story, right? And it seems a little boring because accountants don't fight, they're not fighting the police, they're not fighting, they're not producing drugs or anything like that, they're not getting into shootouts, they're keeping notes, they're keeping ledgers, they're laundering money, they're moving profits, they're, figuring out cost and P&L and all that. And those are, an accountant is only seen in a real economic organization, right? The average criminal does not have an accountant, they don't have a banker, they don't have a financial manager. And we see that the strength of the drug trade wasn't due to the violence, it wasn't due to the fear, it wasn't due to the production of the drugs. It was the fact that it was an actual business, it was an actual economy, it was an international global market that was managed by real financial managers, real accountants, people like that, that made it a true economic business. It wasn't just a group of people in Colombia moving drugs, it was a global network. So globalization is often thrown around in today's society, but really what it refers to is just the increasing movement of goods and money, information and culture, really anything across the national border. So basically any good or service or idea moving from one nation to another. And a lot of times it's used with legal businesses like Apple or Amazon or anything like that, right? Where an Apple product is used not just in America where the company was founded, but all across, the Western and Eastern hemisphere. It's used in every other country, right? It's a globalist company. So the cocaine trade works the exact same way. Coca is grown in Colombia. It can be processed somewhere else in Latin America or even processed in the United States. And then it moves through multiple countries throughout the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, through shipping containers, through planes, different international shipping routes. It's a product that is produced in one country and sold to a consumer thousands of miles away. It's an import and it's an export. It's not legitimate, it's illegal, but it is a real business. And then once it's sold to the consumers, the profits are then laundered and put back into the business. The profits are reinvested to grow the business. So it works the same as any other business. And I think that's why the accounting story works so well, is that it shows that it's not just like petty crime. It's not just the way that we often think of crimes, violence and chaos or whatever, but it's a legitimate economy with profits, investments, and global and international, export and import. Not just Colombian thing. And so going back to what I was talking about earlier, I think a concept that illustrates this really well is called the balloon effect. So if you think about squeezing a balloon, you squeeze one side, the air just doesn't go away, it just moves somewhere else. So the same thing, you close production or transport of cocaine in one country, it's just gonna go to another country, right? Cocaine production first was mass produced in Peru. And then when the US cracked down on Peru, it moved to Colombia. Same thing, after Colombia, moved to Bolivia, and moved all across Latin America. So when the authorities shut down one trafficking route, it creates a balloon effect. The traffickers are just gonna create another. Same with any other economic idea. You close off. As long as there's demand for it, if you start to regulate one idea of it, it's just going to pop up in another way. People will always modernize. If there's a demand and there's an economic incentive, people will figure out a way to supply it. So to conclude with all this, I think Plan Colombia was successful in a lot of ways. It made Colombia a lot safer, made it a lot more modern, and weakened a lot of the violent armed groups that were terrorizing the country. But its goal of ending the cocaine trade was unsuccessful. And in fact, all it did was transform it. It just modernized it. It made it into a more modern economy, the same way that regulation makes any business adapt to a modern economy. And I think the accounting story argues that very well. It argues that cocaine should not be viewed as a Colombian issue or an organized crime issue, but it should be seen as a function in a global economy that's driven by demand, supply, financial investment, the same as any other business. And so that's why I think the decades that and billions of dollars that the US has invested in ending the drug trade has just reshaped it instead of eliminating it. And I think this changes, and I think this can improve the way we think of the drug war as a whole. Because if we think of cocaine as a global market and a global business, the same as any other business, then we realize that it's not just going to be ended by military force. It's not going to be ended by, pouring more money into a defense budget and shutting down other groups. I think that if we actually sit down and address why is there an international demand, why is there a financial incentive for people to keep engaging in illegal trafficking, and why does our global economic system continue to make illegal trade in cocaine or any drug, heroin or methamphetamine or fentanyl now, why is that still profitable? So I think that really changes how we think of the drug trade and the war on drugs as a whole. And I think if we think about it that way, we can actually get a real solution out of it.